Good afternoon, everybody. I hope at least some of you are still awake. My name is Anna Bonell. I am based at the Medical Research Council unit in the Gambia, part of London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'm also affiliated with the Aga Khan University, and I'll touch briefly on some of the work that we're doing in Pakistan and with Bristol as well. So I'm going to take a slightly different lens to the crisis that we've talked about today. And I would like to centre the whole of my talk around gender and to point out the fact that climate impacts are not gender neutral. This is a statement from the UN. And to really highlight the fact that women are disproportionately affected by the climate impacts. And why is that? Partly it's because they make up 70% of those who are living in extreme poverty. There is still a huge gender disparity in terms of access to decision-making and being in those rooms that can change policy. But also, in every society still, social obligations rest mainly with women. That said, I would like also to point out three things. Women are not passive victims here. Women can be extremely powerful agents of change. If you educate a woman, you educate a community. And thirdly, women need to be centred around our conversation for solutions. And they need to be at the forefront of the decisions on the adaptations that protect their health. So, there we go. I'm going to talk about pregnancy, the most vulnerable time in a woman's life. And I will touch first on the background of why this is an important aspect for us to consider in terms of heat and health. And then I'm going to talk about some of our findings from the Gambia. So this is a systematic review and meta-analysis that was led by Matthew Chersich's group, showing that pretty much there's very good evidence now that women exposed to extreme heat during their pregnancy have a higher risk of preterm birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, and a whole host of other pregnancy-related complications, which have implications not just for the woman, but also for the ongoing health of the infant and neonate. Sorry. And this is a study that was actually just published last month. This is from Climate Central. And they quantified the pregnancy risk over the last 5 years globally. And this was identifying the number of days above the 95th percentile, which was recognised as an increased risk for preterm birth. And according to this, you can see that pretty much everywhere there is an increased risk. So in a third of countries, there was at least 30 days of increased risk associated with climate change. But really what I want to highlight is that this band across the tropical and subtropical regions, where you can see that the exposure is so much worse than other places. And why is this important? Sorry, the numbers haven't come up very clearly. So from that systematic review, what they found was that actually the health impacts of extreme heat is different in low middle income countries versus low income countries. So in low middle income countries, you may have a 10% increased risk of preterm birth with heat exposure. Whereas if you're in a lower income country, that increases to 61%. So not only are we talking about an area where it's much more exposed, the then impacts of that exposure is also worse. So I will move on to the Gambia. I have been living and working in the Gambia for the last 6 years, and I've had an amazing privilege to work with a fantastic community there. Most of the work that I'm presenting is from a region which is almost entirely reliant on subsistence farming, a group that hasn't really been discussed yet. I was in the nutrition group earlier today, and really the sort of conversations around subsistence farming and exposures kind of pulls together both heat and nutrition, and sort of pulls these in together, and I feel like this is a good space for us to maybe think about it and discuss it in more detail. what you can see here is that also there is no mechanization of farming in this setting. So in the picture you can see our pregnant participants rice farming, so they're weeding, they're removing the grass from around the rice, and in the foreground you can see Jennifer, one of my colleagues, who's struggling through the rice field to take their tympanic temperature measurements to see what was going on with them. So this study was an observational cohort study of subsistence farmers in this particular region, and really we were trying to understand in this highly acclimatized group, what is the impact of heat in their everyday life, which includes being outside working, and how does that affect both them and their babies. So there's a couple of things that was I think sort of like related to many of the talks that we've already heard about. Exposures are very high in this area. We're in West Africa, not far from Burkina Faso. We know that the climate data tells us it's very high, and then from our direct measurements, we also saw that it was very high. What was interesting, because most of the farming work is under the direct sun, the UTCI was on occasion 10 degrees hotter than what you would see at the hourly ERA5 equivalent temperature, whereas the sort of daily average maybe was a bit more accurate. Something to consider for us going forward is that there is no clear definition for what fetal heat strain is, or what fetal heat strain could even look like. And so we put in a series of different tests that we did to try to understand whether or not the fetus was at risk. So this is doing a Doppler scan that we did at baseline and then in the field whilst they were working at the end of their working shift. And it gave us an indication of how well the placenta is functioning whilst they're at work under these conditions. So a little bit of results, sort of similar to what you've already seen. There was a huge amount of heat exposure in this group. So unfortunately, our study was curtailed somewhat by COVID. So it ran from 2019 and then was cut a little bit short in 2020 when everything shut down from COVID. But during the time that we recruited, there wasn't a single day that women were not exposed to moderate heat stress using the UTCI categories doing their everyday work. And again, in this what you would think would be highly acclimatized group, these women have lived and worked in the Gambia their entire lives, we still saw a significant increase in their temperatures, their tympanic temperatures and their skin temperatures during their working shift, and an increase in their physiological strain index with the heat exposure that they were exposed to. And this study, and then looking at the fetus in particular, we found this linear relationship between fetal heart rate and heat stress exposure of the mother. And that's actually also been found in several other studies, sort of other observational cohort studies ongoing as well. And when we looked at the Doppler, we have an indication that there is a potential threshold of effect. So you don't want the blood flow to the placenta to reduce. That's not good. And so at this point here, you can see that the blood flow starts to go up, which would imply that there's a reduction in blood flow to the placenta. The placenta is less able to work. And so this is in normal pregnancies. We see a cutoff of around 30, 31, 32. But in adverse pregnancy outcomes, perhaps there is a difference in the heat reaction in those women. We are now following this up with part of our cohort study to explore this in much more detail, as are several of the other colleagues in the audience in their pregnancy cohort. So hopefully in the coming years, we'll have a clearer idea around blood flow and thresholds of effects. Moving on, I'm going to talk about slightly longer term impacts and birth outcome impacts that we've also looked at. So again, in the same region of the Gambia, again, subsistence farmers. This is now using a randomized control trial and looking back at the evidence of the randomized control trial to understand whether maternal heat exposure affects intrauterine growth, but then also whether it affects the first 2 years of life and growth in the first 2 years of life. The heat stress exposure, again, is very seasonal, so obviously complex in terms of trying to disentangle the seasonal impacts. And the reason why we thought that this was an important aspect is we were sort of coming together with the different potential mechanistic pathways, and this is all still very much unknown, so we wanted to build the evidence to understand this in more detail. And when it comes to the first 2 years of life, this was our pathways that we thought heat in itself might act on why you see this intersection between heat and growth. And again, it sort of pulls the heat and nutrition themes together and sort of makes you want to attend everything in the same time. So what we found was that heat exposure in the first trimester was associated with slightly smaller babies. And this is builds on the beginnings of the evidence around implantation and placenta structure formation being impacted by heat, which then could have longer term impacts on birth. And then, very interestingly, in the third trimester, which is when the women were being supplemented by either micronutrient supplements or protein energy supplements, the protein energy supplement group had an impact of heat, which you didn't see in the micronutrient supplements. So we interpret that as either the protein energy supplements increase your internal metabolic energy creation and put added heat stress onto the woman, or is there something in micronutrient supplementation that protects pregnant women from the impacts of heat? This is just the same sort of thing. And for the first two years of life, although this is like a very much under-explored area, really, but this is very much highlighting the fact that the impacts of heat are not just in pregnancy, but they continue onwards. So in the first 2 years of life, we found that there was a significant reduction in weight for age Z scores and weight for height Z scores, and that increases the risk of wasting. Although we did not find any impact on height for age Z scores, so we didn't see an increased risk of stunting in this group, which is slightly in conflict with what other groups have found. So very happy to discuss in more detail. And then very briefly, I wanted to talk about some of our qualitative work where we think about whether or not some of the very basic recommendations that the WHO have of what to do to protect yourself in the heat, how does that translate into for our women in our setting? So this is the advice. Don't go out, don't do strenuous activity. Very difficult to say. Remember that in the sun, temperatures are much hotter. Yes, we can definitely say that. And try to spend 2 to 3 hours in a cool place. So pregnant women in our setting very much recognise that heat is a problem when they're pregnant and that it causes them to have a very difficult time during their pregnancy. And some of them are able to take the choice to cool down, but not all of them. Not everybody has the social support that allows them to take a rest and avoid the heat, reduce the amount of farming that they have to do, because the farming is linked to being able to feed their family. Being able to keep your home cool, I think we've had a lot of discussions around the built environment. I would just like to point out that if your village looks like that or your house looks like that, something around turning the AC on or using an electric fan when you have 12 hours of load shedding is not really possible. However, if we have time to discuss at some point, this is the study that we are just starting up in Pakistan. And what you see here is the intervention, which is a double roof. And the surface temperature in the double roof is 38 versus the next door roof, which is 56. So some of these interventions, this is in a rural area in Pakistan, may be effective for us. I'll just say a huge thank you to the team and to Wellcome for funding everything. Thank you.